Welcome to Audiobook 365 Stories.
The story follows Linda, a young enslaved woman who is moved to the household of Dr. Flint and his cruel wife. This story is narrated by Linda herself. Dr. Flint, a doctor in the area, had married the sister of my mistress, and now I was owned by their little daughter. I did not feel happy as I prepared to go to my new home. What made me even more unhappy was that my brother William was also bought by the same family. My father, by his nature and from his habit of working as a skilled mechanic, felt more like a free man than most slaves. My brother was a lively boy, and because he was raised this way, he learned early to dislike the names master and mistress. One day, both his father and his mistress called him at the same time. He didn't know who he should go to first and felt confused about who he should obey. He finally decided to go to his mistress. When my father scolded him for this, he said, "You both called me, and I didn't know who I should go to first." "You are my child," replied our father, "and when I call you, you should come right away, even if you have to go through fire and water." Poor Willie. He was now going to learn his first lesson about obeying a master. Our grandmother tried to cheer us up with hopeful words, and these words felt true in our young hearts. When we arrived at our new home, we faced cold looks, cold words, and cold treatment. We were glad when night came. On my narrow bed, I cried and cried. I felt so lonely and alone. I had been there almost a year when a dear little friend of mine died. I heard her mother cry as the dirt fell on her only child's coffin, and I turned away from the grave, feeling thankful that I still had something left to love. I met my grandmother, who said, "Come with me, Linda," and from her voice, I knew something sad had happened. She took me away from the people and then said, "My child, your father is dead." Dead? How could I believe it? He had died so suddenly, I had not even heard that he was sick. I went home with my grandmother. My heart was angry who had taken away my mother, father, mistress, and friend. My good grandmother tried to comfort me. "Who knows God's ways?" she said. "Maybe they were taken kindly from the bad days that are coming." Many years later, I often thought of this. She promised to be like a mother to her grandchildren, as much as she was allowed to. Strengthened by her love, I returned to my master's home. I thought I would be allowed to go to my father's house the next morning, but I was told to go get flowers so my mistress's house could be decorated for a party that night. I spent the day gathering flowers and weaving them into garlands, while my father's dead body was lying only a mile away from me. Did my owners care about that? He was only a piece of property to them. They also thought he had spoiled his children by teaching them to feel like human beings. This was dangerous for slaves to believe and a threat to the masters. The next day I followed his body to a simple grave next to that of my dear mother. There were some people who knew how good my father was and respected his memory. My home now felt sadder than ever. The laughter of the little slave children sounded harsh and cruel to me. It was selfish to feel this way about the happiness of others. My brother walked around with a very serious face. I tried to comfort him, saying, "Be brave, Willie. Better days will come soon." "You don't know anything, Linda," he replied. "We will have to stay here all our lives. We will never be free." I argued that we were getting older and stronger, and maybe soon we would be allowed to work for ourselves. Then we could earn money to buy our freedom. William said this was much easier to say than to do, and he also didn't plan to buy his freedom. We argued about this topic every day. In Dr. Flint's house, little care was given to the slaves' meals. If they could grab a bit of food when it was there, that was good enough. I did not worry much about this because, on my errands, I often passed by my grandmother's house. There was always something there for me. I was often threatened with punishment if I stopped there, and my grandmother, to avoid delaying me, would often stand at the gate with something for my breakfast or lunch. I owed all my comforts to her, both spiritual and physical. It was her hard work that provided my small set of clothes. I remember very clearly the rough dress made of wool and linen that Mrs. Flint gave me every winter. How I hated it! It was one of the symbols of slavery. While my grandmother was helping to support me with her hard earnings, the $300 she had lent her mistress were never paid back. When her mistress died, her son-in-law, Dr. Flint, was put in charge of the estate. When my grandmother asked him for the money, he said there was no money left in the estate, and the law did not allow him to pay her back. However, the law did not stop him from keeping the silver candlesticks that were bought with that money. I think they will be passed down in the family for many generations. My grandmother's mistress had always promised her that she would be free when she died, and people said that she put this promise in her will. But when the estate was settled, Dr. Flint told my grandmother that, because of this situation, she had to be sold. On the chosen day, the usual ad was posted, saying there would be a public sale of Negroes, horses, etc. Dr. Flint came to tell my grandmother that he did not want to hurt her feelings by selling her at a public auction, and he preferred to sell her in private. My grandmother could see through his lies. She knew he was embarrassed about selling her. She was a strong woman, and if he was mean enough to sell her when her mistress had wanted her to be free, she wanted people to know about it. She had been selling crackers and jams to many families for a long time. Because of this, Aunt Martha, as people called her, was well known, and everyone who knew her respected her intelligence and good character. People also knew about her long and faithful service to the family and her mistress's promise to set her free. When the day of the sale came, my grandmother took her place among the items for sale, and as soon as the auction started, she jumped up on the auction block. Many voices called out, "Shame! Shame! Who is going to sell you, Aunt Martha? Don't stand there. That is not the place for you." Without saying a word, she waited quietly for what would happen. No one made a bid for her. At last, a weak voice said, $50. It was a lady of 70 years, the sister of my grandmother's late mistress. She had lived for 40 years under the same roof as my grandmother. She knew how faithfully my grandmother had served her owners and how unfairly she had been treated. She decided to protect her. The auctioneer waited for a higher bid, but people respected her wishes and no one bid more. She could not read or write, so when the bill of sale was prepared, she signed it with a cross. But what did that matter when she had a big heart full of kindness? She gave my grandmother her freedom. At that time, my grandmother was only 50 years old. Many hard years had gone by since then, and now my brother and I were slaves to the man who had stolen her money and tried to steal her freedom. One of my mother's sisters, called Aunt Nancy, was also a slave in his family. She was a kind, good aunt to me, and she was both the housekeeper and the helper to her mistress. She was there for everything. Mrs. Flint, like many women in the South, had no energy. She didn't have the strength to manage her own household. But her nerves were very strong, and she could sit in her chair and watch a woman being whipped until blood ran down from each hit of the whip. She was a member of the church, but taking the Lord's Supper did not make her feel kind or Christian. If dinner was not served at the exact time on that Sunday, she would stand in the kitchen, wait until it was done, and then spit in all the pots and pans that were used for cooking. She did this to stop the cook and her children from eating any of the leftover gravy or other scraps. The slaves could only eat what she chose to give them. Food was weighed out carefully by the pound and ounce, 3 times a day. I can tell you that she made sure no one ate wheat bread from her flour. She knew exactly how many biscuits a certain amount of flour would make and exactly how big each biscuit should be. Dr. Flint was very picky about food. The cook never sent a meal to his table without feeling afraid. If there was a dish he didn't like, he would either order her to be whipped or make her eat every single bite of it right in front of him. The poor, hungry woman might not mind eating it, but she did not want him forcing it down her throat until she choked. They had a pet dog who was a bother in the house. The cook was told to make some corn mush for him. The dog wouldn't eat it, and when they held his head over it, froth came from his mouth into the bowl. He died just a few minutes later. When Dr. Flint came in, he said the mush had not been cooked well, and that was why the dog would not eat it. He called the cook and made her eat the mush. He thought her stomach was stronger than the dog's, but she got very sick afterward. This poor woman suffered a lot from her master and mistress. Sometimes she was locked up, away from her nursing baby, for a whole day and night. After a few weeks in the family, I saw a plantation slave brought to town by order of his master. It was almost night when he arrived, and Dr. Flint told them to take him to the workhouse and tie him up so that his feet were just above the ground. In that painful position, he had to wait until Dr. Flint finished his tea. I will never forget that night. Never before had I heard hundreds of blows falling, one after another, on a human being. His sad cries and his "Oh, please don't, master," stayed in my ears for months after. People guessed about why he was punished so badly. Some said the master accused him of stealing corn. Others said the slave had argued with his wife in front of the overseer and had said his master was the father of her child. They were both black, but the child was very fair-skinned. The next morning, I went to the workhouse and saw the cowhide whip still wet with blood and the floorboards covered in blood. The poor man lived, but he kept arguing with his wife. A few months later, Dr. Flint sold them both to a slave trader. The guilty master took the money and felt good that he wouldn't have to see or hear from them again. When the woman was handed over to the trader, she said, "You promised to treat me well." He replied, "You have talked too much. Curse you." She had forgotten it was against the rules for a slave to say who the father of her child was. Slaves also suffer from cruelty from other people besides the master. I once saw a young slave girl dying soon after her baby was born, and the baby was nearly white. In her pain, she cried, "Oh Lord, come and take me." Her mistress stood there, mocking her like a demon. "Are you suffering?" she said. "Good. You deserve it all and more too." The girl's mother said, "The baby is dead. Thank God, and I hope my poor child will be in heaven soon too." "Heaven," the mistress said. "There is no such place for someone like her and her illegitimate child." The poor mother turned away, crying. Her dying daughter called her softly, and as she leaned over her, I heard her say, "Don't cry, mother. God knows everything, and He will have mercy on me." Her pain became so terrible that her mistress couldn't stay in the room any longer. But even as she left, she was still smiling in a mean way. 7 children called her their mother. The poor black woman had only one child, and she watched her child's eyes close in death, feeling thankful that God had taken her away from the greater pain of life.